and constantly named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. And with that, let me turn everything over to Peter to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you, Shannon. It's so good to be here. We were trying a little Nirvana bluegrass music on the way in. And Irene, thank you for a really nice short presentation on that. There will be more, as she said, when we get to the Q&A part. And I've got to put my little Flog of the Books thing up here as well. But let's dive right in, more importantly here, to talking about growing these programs, because they are things that need to be nurtured. One of the things that's most frustrating to me these days is that organizations keep saying data is the new oil, and it's not. It's a bad metaphor. It really doesn't make sense. If you take it and make it the new soil, it'll make a little bit more sense to you, and I'll show you how that gets into it. What we're going to talk about today is some confounding characteristics, because there's generally a low level of understanding, even among the business community, forget about the population in general, that data has to be recognized as uniquely valuable, but at the same time comprised largely of redundant, obsolete, or trivial information, and that becomes a conundrum for us. So we're going to talk a little bit about making better data decisions around this, and I'll lead you through three strategies. The first one is to keep your data governance initiatives practically focused. And by practically, I mean if somebody's sitting at a meeting and says, I'm not sure why we're here at this meeting doing this thing, it's not practical enough. The discipline is relatively immature compared to a discipline like accounting that actually has thousands and thousands of years of tradition. Going by the book is not necessarily a great starting place on this, and a more targeted approach to data governance seems to help with organizations so that you don't have to restart or perhaps restart your data governance initiatives. Second strategy then is around making sure that people understand that you will no longer need data governance when you no longer need an HR program in your organization. Data governance is central to data management, and it must be decoupled from an IT-centric type strategy. Instead, have something that is directly supportive of the organizational strategy. Third strategy that we're going to talk about then from a data governance perspective is to gradually add ingredients. It's kind of like telling you the way to cook. You, of course, are the cooks for your organization. You're the best experts that can do this. And we'll talk about how the frameworks work within this. Picking one can be a good starting place. How we start to work stewardship and concepts like that in there. Another word that'll come into it is fiduciary in there. We'll talk about checklists and various types of approaches and some worst practices as well. And then finish up with some little data governance in action, which is really all about storytelling. Storytelling is how we make our decisions, how we go through life and try to start figuring out and how we communicate with others. So let's dive right on in here and just once again lament briefly that IT still thinks that data is a business problem. If they can connect to the server, then my job is done. And business thinks that IT is managing the data for them. After all, who would the chief information officer be taking care of but the organization's data? Again, this has caused confusion. We need to repair that damage. It's a big, big challenge. Similarly, you've probably also heard me say that data is our most powerful, underutilized, and poorly managed organizational asset. It's the only asset that we have that is not depletable, is not degrading, and is durable in nature. Durable in nature means that the asset is something you plan to invest in to make even more. Again, if it's public sector, we're going to go mission. If it's private sector, we're talking money around all this. And it exists at the strategic level. So data assets really do win when we compare to other assets. They are literally uniquely valuable in this. But as I mentioned before, oil is a really bad way to think about it, and I like to think about it as soil. There's two things in soil that are better than oil. One, you don't ever prepare the ground when you're going to do oil mining, you just dive in and do it, right? Second one, so in the case of data, you need to prepare the ground the same way as you prepare a plot of land that you're going to do planting on. You don't just randomly throw seeds around the yard and hope that good things are going to happen on that. And the other thing that's real important here is you don't plant seeds on Monday and expect to eat them on Friday. There is a time dimension that is critically important here as well. That said, you do need some sizzle to sell your data projects on the way because, as I said, people don't really understand them. Being uniquely valuable data deserves its own strategy. It deserves attention that is on par with similar organizational assets, and it requires professional administration to make up for past neglects. In fact, it's so confounding that detailed and complexity, outsiders typically don't want to hear any more about it in there. And most are relatively unqualified from a lack of architectural or engineering perspective. Data is taught completely inconsistently across the world, and the primary focus is on technology rather than on business impact. And that is incredibly bad because it gives people the wrong motivations. Finally, data is not really well understood as a result of the first two because of the lack of standards. We have poor literacy and unknown dependency, and it has to be relearned by every single group. I showed this little blip of Wally Easton throwing pink fuzzy balls at a piano keyboard. He's learned how to do this very, very well. No question about that. At the same time, however, it's probably not the best way to learn about playing a piano. And unfortunately, all of your work groups in your organization have learned something about data that wasn't necessarily what you had planned to teach them about data. And when we look overall at this, this is a new survey just came out a couple weeks ago from Randy Bean and Tom Davenport. Are we driving data with innovation? Most companies are saying no. Are we competing on data and analytics? 40% say yes, 60% say no. Are we managing data as a business asset? Largely no. Are we creating a data-driven organization or forging a data-driven culture? No and no. In fact, the most thing that is consistent about this survey, and one of the reasons I like them asking scientific surveys on a regular basis, is because from 2018 to 2021, the general aspect of people and process challenges are much greater than technology challenges, and there have been no significant changes in this the entire time we've done this. One of the reasons this is so problematic and so difficult for people to understand is because they don't do a good job of root cause analysis. Every business problem has a data as a root cause. The problem is that root cause is somewhat obscured by different IT systems and business processes around here. And the thing that they have in common, which is not easy to see right away, is the poor results that are due to the data. Now, I mentioned also the ROT factor around this. ROT is an acronym I did not invent, although I've used it for years and years. I can't find the source of it. It was on the internet somewhere. Somebody ever finds it, send it to me. I want to make sure they get credit for that. But the idea is that better organized data increases in value. If somebody disagrees with you about that, then have them take the book off the back, the spine off the back of a book cover, remove the page numbering, all the other pre-information era artifacts of architecture that we use to read books, and try to make sense from a bunch of pieces of paper without page numbers and all this. And of course, what happens is quickly this knowledge becomes obsolete and not useful. Better data, better organized data is clearly better in value. And most of organizational data, and by most, I'm saying 80% minimum, is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And the problem with that is not that anybody disagrees with my 80%. The only correction I've gotten in 30 years is some organizations claim that up to 95% of their organizational data is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. With this kind of knowledge or lack of it in our organizations, is it any surprise that half companies always say that they make inaccurate or bad decisions based on bad data? Business decision makers and technical decision makers are not data knowledgeable. Therefore, they make bad data decisions that result in poor treatment of organizational data assets and poor quality data, which leads, of course, to poor organizational outcomes. The real question is, how do you break out of this cycle? Part of it is by showing the costs. Yes, these are gross statistics, but millions in productivity, in redundant and siloed efforts, in extraordinarily poorly thought out hardware and software purchases, delays being incurred into decision-making from the inadequate information, being reactive instead of proactive, and finally spending 20 to 40% of your IT dollars in a way that could be saved. Again, I don't know about you all, but many of your organizations spend large amounts of money on IT. This is easy easy savings in all of this. So let's talk to our first strategy then. The first question is, how old is your profession? Now, in this case, I'm married to an accountant, and we give accounting 8,000 years of formal practices. We've been selling beer to each other for more than 8,000 years. These are cuneiform beer records over here on the left-hand side of all this. We date our data profession back to the time of Augusta Ada King, who was the daughter of Lord Byron and the world's first programmer. She invented programming before computers were made, much less anything else. This is really where our discipline starts. So it's okay for us to acknowledge that we're not as mature perhaps as the accounting profession, but we certainly don't want to stay there. Now, when people ask about governance, everybody understands corporate governance. There is a new dimension in corporate governance, but nevertheless, corporate governance has been around for a long, long time. The new development I mentioned here is that Jamie Dimon and a bunch of other CEOs got together and said, you know what? It's not always going to be all about maximizing shareholder dollars. There is a social good component put into these types of activities. And when you have something like this, it's worth watching. We'll see what happens. But this all does fall under the corporate governance initiative. Of course, if we're going to do corporate governance, we need to do IT governance as well. And the idea is we want to make sure that IT strategy is aligned with business strategy. We want to make absolutely sure that we provide measurable results in the process and answer a few key questions around strategic alignment, value delivery, resource management, risk management, and performance issues. And IT governance, we've gotten pretty good. I don't normally recommend books beyond my own, but I do want to recommend John Ladley's second edition here of Data Governance. We were on a call with one of the other DAMA chapters recently, and he's actually working on some other interesting developments as I am around data literacy. So those will be some things that will come up to play. But let's even take literacy. If you look out there on the internet, there are 7 good definitions of data governance. I'm not going to read them all to you. What I want you to imagine instead is that you're in an elevator and somebody from upper management steps on the elevator, looks over at you and says, Peter, you work for me. I hear you're working on data governance. Can you tell me what it is? And I just imagine that if you turned around to that individual and said, yes, ma'am, data governance is the exercise of authority and control over the management of data assets, that would not be a terribly satisfying conversation from that point on. So I like to start off with something that's even simpler than that. The idea is that we are doing data governance, and what data governance means we are doing is that we are managing data with guidance, which immediately lets people start to think, okay, so if we're not doing data governance, we're managing our most valuable special asset without guidance. That's an issue, right? Now, if I'm talking to a group of more senior management, I'll add a slightly different word in here, managing data decisions with guidance. Both of those two responses to managers asking you what data governance is are likely to provide additional questions and answers, which is, of course, exactly what you're looking for so that you can have conversations with people about these and bring them into the conversation and let them see that managing your data with guidance is going to make things faster, better, cheaper, or some combinations thereof all the way around. Those of you that haven't seen it yet, even though it's been out for a while, the DIMBOK 2 has data governance as a central component to it. It's the one thing we put in the center to say that you should do that more than the others. It's interesting, though, too, when we put the DIMBOK out in 2009 for the first time, people looked at this and said, oh, this means I must do all these things if I'm going to do data management and data governance. And that wasn't what we intended, so that's a lesson that we'll take with it. But it is important to understand that it's more likely these things will work in concert with each other than they will individually. So a way to think about, for example, governance helping strategy out is to say, look, guys, don't just try one thing. Let's instead say that what we're more likely to do is build on a strength of 3 things around here, so that perhaps we should think of this as governing a little bit around our warehousing and business intelligence management and our data quality pieces. And we put those things into play. Another version of that same thing might come along and have a slightly different outcome and say, no, metadata is going to be the important piece on which we should focus. And a third version of it might actually look at reference and master data. Now, by showing you these pieces, one thing also important to point out from a governance perspective that won't happen in the rest of the data world is that you've gone around this rodeo now 3 times. You've gone around this data warehousing rodeo 3 times, and you've got 1x of reference, metadata, and data quality practices around all of these. Another aspect of keeping data governance practically focused is using a concept that I call a lighthouse project. The idea here is that while you could do a lot of things with data governance, it might be better to start off focusing on a subset of the things that further organizational strategy that happens to intersect with an opportunity to improve understanding of data as an asset by the business. And let's go for 3 here. Maybe we get the opportunity to practice some data skills, of which data governance is one of those areas. And when you have a good match between all 3 of those areas, that's a great place to get started. Sometimes you'll be able to do something like that. Sometimes it won't be nearly as practical in there. The difference between data governance and data management is also important to be able to articulate. Governance is policy level, general guidelines and directions. For example, all information not marked public should be considered confidential. Data management then is the implementation of this, delivering the solutions in order to do these things. And the only way your organization can do this well is if it understands the difference between a program and a project. Now, we called our version of the data management body of knowledge DIMBOK in obvious homage to the Project Institute Management's body of knowledge, or the PMBOK. And I'm quoting here from the PMBOK that just talks about the difference between programs and projects. Your data program, and it is your duty as data governance professionals, is to let them know we will no longer need the data program when we no longer need an organizational HR program. Oh my goodness, what a crazy thought, right? Let's get rid of HR. They're done. We've hired all the people that we're going to hire. Everybody who's here is going to behave extraordinarily well. We might as well get rid of the lawyers while we're at it, along with that. Nobody, of course, will ever say anything along those lines so crazy. And you have to make them understand that the idea that data does not occupy a similar portion of the organizational mindshare is equally as crazy. Another place that data governance needs to be focused is originally, and by the way, don't take all these on at once. It's way too many. Pick one at a time and get yourself solved that way. Think about the way we've also taught people how to implement strategy. It's been typically what we call IT project or application centric. And that's because we've taught people for the past 40 years that your organization develops a strategy, then they create some IT projects, and from there we do some data stuff. The problem with that, of course, is that it's really the tail wagging the dog. And our good friend Dave McComb has a wonderful book that talks about the horrors that occur in organizations to do this. Several other renowned authors have done a wonderful job on this as well. Let's just take a quick look at the idea here that organizational strategy tends to drive IT strategy, and absolutely agree with that. But in most places that I've visited and worked with over the years, it's data strategy that falls to the bottom of that pile. And this is just wrong. Where's Morgan Freeman here?
This is wrong.
Thank you, Morgan Freeman. I'm certain he doesn't appreciate his image being appropriated that way, but that's what happens when you're a really fine actor and can say it just exactly the way you want to say it. Yes, this is wrong. So how should it be? Well, we're really talking about, in this case, IT strategy coming from organizational strategy, but so also should data strategy. The idea that data strategy, in fact, is superior in many cases to IT strategy because well-done data governance can help you more correctly implement your IT strategy. And I've already mentioned the 20 to 40% savings in IT costs in today's environment. Yes, of course, there are things that go back and forth. What this leads to, though, is a complete revamp of the process. Strategy should drive your data and information needs from an organization-wide perspective, and then and only then should you be developing IT projects out of this. This will give you the idea that the data assets are not formed on Salesforce's or SAP's perspective of what a customer is and should be. And by the way, neither of them are wrong in there, but they're probably not exactly right for your organization either. The system will support organizational data needs and complement existing process flows in there. And finally, we can get maximal reuse out of all of these pieces in here. Again, I've got a book in that area as well that is on sale for the duration of this particular webinar. Isn't that a wonderful little thing they do with the publishers there? Excuse me. So let's look at data strategy and data governance in context in here. The reason most data governance initiatives fail in my experience or run into trouble is because they're trying to do too much too quickly. Yes, there's lots of things done. Strategy is what tells us what needs to be done first, second, and third. And I really don't number things beyond 1, 2, 3. Maybe I'm just old and can't count as much, but I find you just don't get a chance to get down very far on the list on that. And of course, the outputs from governance should be how well is that data strategy working. Remember, our data strategy here is directly supportive of the organizational strategy, unfiltered through an IT strategy that is going to garble the message in many, many ways. Data governance in Peter's world is also driving IT projects because the data now needs to be delivered in ways that the organization better understands as opposed to does not. That there's some feedback loops that we'll put into this particular diagram, and it's just too complicated. I really don't want to see too much on that. Let's make this a little bit simpler. There we go. Data strategy here is the idea that what are the data assets doing to support the organization? And that's got to be expressed in business goals, in clear, understandable by both management and IT type of language. And that the language of data governance has to be metadata. If you are speaking anything other than metadata, you are going to run the risk of completely doing the wrong kind of thing. We'll throw in here some data stewards as well, just to make sure that they understand that the goal there is also expressed in metadata. And the question is, what is the most effective use of the steward investment that I have made in here? And the stewards, of course, report back progress, plans, and challenges around all of that. Let's look at how many organizations attempt to do this from an implementation perspective. Oftentimes, when they're working in this area, what you'll see is that people will look at what happens on the top of the screen. And the top of the screen is that data improves over time. And the idea is with the right feedback, the right structures in place, that's wonderful. But when management finds out that the time is measured in years instead of weeks or even perhaps quarters, they become impatient and say, can't you do something faster? And I argue that the faster part should be a data improvement project. And this is where you start to put some wheels on that snail and have the data things improve over time. Because while we have gotten very, very good at celebrating data things happening in our community, we're not quite as good at celebrating data things happening and then something happening in the business in order to do this. Again, this happens on a regular basis. We celebrate data things that are happening, but we forget to go back over and say, oh, by the way, that did make us sell more, or things were delivered faster, or we innovated more around these things. And we've got to become good at this process as well, that we understand data things happen, but that what we're really looking for is, and it happens pretty quick, wow, 2 data things happened, but they actually ended up in the same money pile bucket. Or maybe even we get 3 of them going and we get a really, really good bounce around these areas. It's just something that we have to practice because data is not a project. And being not a project, it means it has a life cycle that is measured in years, as opposed to reasonable project deliverables that might come in a 2-week sprint or 90 days of deliverables. Data evolution is evolving. It does not typically create. One of the things about being as old as I am, and I'm not all that old, but I am old enough to be able to go back and visit organizations that I worked with 40 years ago and see that they are working on exactly the same data structures they were working on back then. A trade is still a trade on Wall Street, right? And these architectural components become prerequisites to agile development practices. In fact, I'll be even stronger about this. One of the things data governance has to do is gain control over IT programs. IT has gotten absolutely fantastic at delivering and filling gaps, but data evolves. We very rarely create new piles of data. We go out and grab new piles of data, but nothing in terms of what's been created here. So the data evolution needs to be separated from, it needs to be housed externally to, and it needs to precede system development activities. If you're trying to do it at the same time, you will get the results that all of us have gotten collectively, which, at least from my perspective, have not been satisfactory. Data management and software development, or IT, must be separated and sequenced because they are two completely different things. Our second strategy then around this is to make sure that this programmatic piece that I talked about a few minutes ago is absolutely central in that. But we've also got to go back in and add ingredients gradually. And the reason we need to do that is because, well, I like to talk about it in sandwich terms. We're a little bit after lunch here on the East Coast of the US, but we'll talk about a better data governance sandwich. Now, most of what happens in this is that there's very uneven sets of data literacy within our organizations. Similarly, there are uneven supplies of data, and the use of standards in that process make it all very confusing and hard to fit together. If we can help to smooth these out by looking at literacy, supply, and use of standards, we can get these things to work together in a much better fashion. But we cannot do this a billion times an hour or even a day without engineering and architecture. And I was all the way in India when I saw a quote from Deming on the cash register at this very tea farm that I was at. Quality engineering and architecture work products cannot happen accidentally. This is why it's important to understand, and of course I'll throw the word data in there as well, data engineering and data architecture projects. Now this is where I'm calling you all from today. I've been quarantined here the same way most of you all have for the last year. We're almost at a full year all the way around, and I'm showing you this not to show you the house per se, but the foundation of something that's out in front of the house. Now, those of you that don't know me as well, I'm a horse husband, and this means that we were borrowing money from the bank and building a barn for the horses. The challenge around this is that there's no equivalent in IT to what they do in the banks. The bank gave me exactly this much money, told me to build a foundation, and then go get the county to inspect it. And only upon receipt of a good, valid county inspection would they give me more money to put in. We need to put this control in place. This is a tougher thing to struggle with from the data governance perspective, but it is absolutely doable. That you can get people to understand, look, they do it in the business trade, they do it in banking, we should do it in IT here as well. Let's not build this next system that comes out until we have a good data foundation in place in order to do this. There are a couple of frameworks that are useful for you all to start in your data governance areas. And the framework is just a system of ideas guiding analysis. You can use it to organize your data. You can use it to determine priorities and assess progress. For example, you would say don't put up the walls until the foundation is passed, right? That makes sense. But put the roof on as quickly as possible because we can work inside in inclement weather should we have something like that occur. When we look at frameworks, here's one from the Dimbach version 1. I'm not going to read you everything on this page. You're going to get these slides, of course, so you could look at it on your own. But it's an input, process, output model, and it has a lot of really good ideas and activities that are around it. Here is yet another framework, and we're going to keep doing this as well to show you a lot of different frameworks. It's not that you should pick one of these and that is the right one for you, but each of these frameworks will inspire you in different ways. Rob Seiner has a good one. His is non-invasive, and he likes to use this particular framework to describe how things are put together. IBM had a data governance council that ran for a couple of years and put out a couple different versions of things. Again, the idea is not I'm showing you what these are now, but take these things and use them yourself. Jill Deshay down at SAS had a really nice one from Baseline that they used. In fact, the Association for American College Personnel even has their own in there. It's kind of amazing when you look at how these things are all put together. Maybe a ship is the right metaphor for you, maybe it's not. The idea, though, is to take a look at those frameworks and kind of try them on, like you're trying on different costumes. How would this work if we use this kind of a structure for our organization? How would this work if we did it this way? It gives you a lot of different options, and more importantly, just as with all uses of models, allows us to use them in ways that we can try out and do the sort of what if around all of that. Let's talk about what are the components that are going to be going into your framework. If you have, in this case, a role of IT that's out here and you've got them doing basically their systems development, I'm going to put up a 4-quadrant diagram here, and on the left-hand side of the quadrant are domain expertise of less, and on the right-hand side, domain expertise greater. Similarly, the roles on the left-hand side of this document are more formally defined, and the roles on the left-hand side are less formally defined. And then, because it's a 4-quadrant diagram, we need to do the x-axis here as well. The things that are below the middle line here are bits and pieces that people below the line will encounter governed data more directly, and they will have more time dedicated to this process than the people on the top who encounter governed data less directly and spent less time dedicated to the task of doing data governance. So let's put the 4 blobs up then. We've got leadership, we've got stewards of some, we've got participants, subject matter experts, and we've got others that are involved in this. Now, just real quick, a piece of guidance around all this. When you appoint your first data governance groups, make sure that you let everybody know this is the first round, right? Because if you put more out there and you say, hey, I'm going to do this, the chances of you getting exactly the right group the first time are very, very challenging. But if you say this is the first round, that gives you the opportunity to make adjustments and put more out there and get them in the second round if you miss the first round doing all of this. Again, the idea here is on the left-hand side, the domain expertise is less, but the roles of leadership and steward are more formally defined. The other users and the subject matter experts, their domain expertise is going to be greater, but the roles are less formally defined. Same thing top and bottom here. The top people are going to encounter governed data less directly. And the bottom half of this, they're going to encounter governed data more directly and have more time dedicated to all of this. So let's talk about the roles that are played here. And typically, organizations will draw a line around the left-hand side of this diagram and say, this is what I'm talking about from my data governance community. By the way, some of you are facing this as single individuals and saying, good luck, one person, you're going to manage all the data in the organization here from a governance perspective. You'll do that until you're able to prove there's a business case for requiring more resources in order to do that. Different groups can draw the lines different ways. It's perfectly okay, and that's you're the best expert as far as looking there. But what's up to leadership is to bring resources to the table. You have to fund this initial piece. Now, when I say fund, I don't mean you're going to lay out hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars before you get results, but it is important to make sure that people have some expectations around all of these ideas. So resources have to come in. There's going to be some kind of data feedback gathered in the process. Eventually, leadership is going to make some decisions and hand them to the data trustees, the people who are fiduciarily charged with maintaining this data. And these decisions will be decisions about data that will hopefully be much more informed than people who do not necessarily able to participate in that. There will be some action from those stewards, and again, you'll get participants and other uses coming into this. There'll be some additional data feedback that you'll have, and hopefully some good ideas and guidance that goes back into the leadership. Notice one thing I have not shown on this diagram is the idea of a data owner. In Peter's world, the only person that owns the data is the organization. The minute you allow any one person to become a data owner of any kind, you introduce an entirely different class of problems in your organization that's going to require work to go back and clean up. I know I get a lot of pushback on that. Happy to bring that on when we get to the Q&A session, as we're about 15 minutes from right at the moment. Again, I wouldn't show this diagram as being really, really complex, but let's simplify it a little bit and get people to work here. And I've said this a couple times in terms of the simplification. My colleague David Lotion has a wonderful book out on data stewards. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's a really good one. And he talks about all of these kinds of stewards that are in his book. There's nothing wrong with having these stewards, but do not introduce multiple types of stewards into your very first round of this. It just confuses people. It is absolutely imperative that you introduce the concept of stewardess and make sure that everybody understands the stewardess concept before you subdivide these things up. Because as soon as you end up with business, technical, project, domain, operational, metadata, legacy data stewards, you need a data steward auditor and a data steward manager that's going to lead them all the way around. I said Lotion. I'm sorry about that. That's David Plotkin is the author of that book. Lotion is up in the University of Maryland, and I apologize to both of you guys for getting your names wrong on that. So let's talk about what is the concept of stewardship. And the idea here is, of course, let's just take it from the dictionary, one who actively directs. Okay, that's actually kind of nice. So if we're going to do a data steward, it would be one who actually directs, and I'll just add my words, the use of organizational data assets in support of specific mission objectives, right? Let's make sure that we use this very simply. Get this concept down such that somebody is a steward and people know what stewards are before we specialize them. You're asking people who don't know much about what's going on to talk about very specialized functions. It's not productive. It's been one of the things that most organizations have had trouble with. So when you get started with data governance, most organizations have some startup costs that they have to do. And there's a little bit of feeling around and, this points to here, and I guess these things will connect eventually. And it's all just very a bit, sort of kind of wobbly on this. Instead, what the idea is that you should very much get people familiar with the idea that there will be a startup and a lather and rinse and repeat cycle. The startup side is on the left-hand side. You've got to decide some context for your governance initiatives. You're going to have to focus at some level on road mapping and activities that you want to have. You're going to have some sort of executive mandate, and you're going to assign the first round of data governance personnel, including the stewards. But once you've done that one time, then you execute a plan. You evaluate your results, you revise the plan, you apply change management, and you repeat until complete, or until you get out of the shower if you're doing the lather, rinse, and repeat cycle. And that's the part that really people need to understand. The stuff on the left-hand side, probably a few people who are approving budgets and things like that will want to get involved in, but not a whole lot more than that. Again, you can go through here and see all kinds of goals and principles and things that you should do. And I'm going to go very quickly through them here, not because I don't think they're unimportant, but because I want to show you where I like to fit them in. And the idea is, okay, we've got a lot of things that we're supposed to do, and look at all these bits and pieces here. Let's not try and do it all at once. Instead, let's evolve our way into this and figure out what is going to work. Evolution, unfortunately, is not goal-oriented. That's a little bit challenging around this. So rather than necessarily focus on all the things on the left-hand side, just say there's going to be a startup process. And I would throw that under one bubble and then say, this is the part we're going to do, repeat until we have actually solved the problems that are out there. This next piece is, I don't think I made it. I'm old, I forget sometimes, but it's a wonderful sort of tongue-in-cheek piece. Where put this thing to the sound of Hotel California. As the warm smell of bagels rose up through the air. You can get the picture and see how that works out on that. The idea here is, though, there are a bunch of worst practices. People will buy in and get commitments. Again, are you in the business or are you in IT in terms of what you're doing? Many organizations get very hung up on deadlines, and they do what we call ready, fire, aim, not generally very good particularly if you're dealing with live weapons, right? Trying to solve the world hunger or get all of our data clean. Gosh, no, we've already seen 80% of your data is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. Why would you want to bother cleaning it? On the other hand, you do have to identify it. Goldilocks, too big, too little, we'll get one right in the middle and it'll be perfect, right? Well, no, I've seen organizations die because they don't actually get this particular process right. Committee overload. If you're having too many meetings, you are clearly doing things incorrectly. Yes, again, there will be exciting things, but there will be things we can do tomorrow. There's always going to be work done in these areas. Failure to implement, where many people talk and talk and talk, but they're waiting on somebody's signature on something. Not a good way to do it. Not dealing with change management, very important. Assuming that technology alone is the answer, and again, many people are going to be focusing on those areas. Yes, you will absolutely need some technology, and I'm certain when Irene comes back, she'll have some thoughts on how to best introduce technology into your organizations. Finally, shadow data systems are all those systems out there that don't really fall under the overall category around all of these bits and pieces. So let's talk a little bit about storytelling. And my favorite storytelling example came from an organization that said, you know what, getting access to data around here is like that Catherine Zeta-Jones scene where she's having to get through all those laser things, right? You guys may or may not remember that particular story, but it was a wonderful one. And this meant something to them. Now, can you imagine if your knowledge workers are thinking this is how they have to get access to your data? The most important communication that happened here was up to management. They didn't turn around to us and say, oh, why are you using that? They were like, oh, this is what you guys mean when you're always talking about it's hard to get data around here. Yes, absolutely, very, very critical. Here's another important story around this. This one was one when I was actually sent to Detroit to learn from the Detroit expertise that they had in terms of how they were doing data governance. I came back with an ad from the Detroit paper that was an advertisement for Chrysler wanting 11 CIOs for their transmission division. So we'll just leave that one hang out there. But one of the lessons that was good to take away from that whole process is a very short story that can be implemented and retold in your organization. In Detroit, if you were attaching things to the engine of the car, that meant success was defined by whether you slowed down the assembly line, because assembly goals were the things that were most important there, which meant you might end up with 3 different bolts, which meant if you were going to maintain that automobile, you had to have 3 different wrenches and bolt inventories and all the rest of that, whereas Toyota took another step back and didn't say, let's use just 1 bolt for all assemblies. What they said was how many of those bolts can be easily standardized and without impacting our production schedule. And they were able to move ways. So again, the story isn't 1 or 3, but it's many and fewer. And that's what we're trying to do, is establish fewer of these processes around that area. Another quick story here about working for the U.S. Army. It was one of the most pleasurable environments to work in, given that the U.S. Army kind of tends to see everything that they do as some form of governance. Again, you're told what to do in many, many different ways. And when they found out something wasn't governed in the U.S. Army, so we used culture in that case to do a very, I think, very credible job making sure that that connects all the way up and down the issue. Another part of that process, though, turned out to be, interestingly enough, a similar organization buying tanks. And when you buy a tank, you buy about 3 million data items. Well, this tank story became part of the lore of the organization, because out of those 3 million different values that you buy when you buy a tank, exactly one of them controlled whether that tank was obsolete or not. And while that may not sound like a huge thing, how many people who are managing tanks and doing all sorts of tank work and things like that are able to track that? Well, it turned out the difference was about $5 billion in dollars. And that's a very large number that even Congress pays attention to, given this type of a process. There's a long tail on many of these things. If you look at what's happening out there, this is the idea of mission readiness, storage costs, maintaining manuals and spare parts for tanks that you're never going to drive. Again, another $1.5 billion that they were able to pull together from all that. You hear a little bit about spreadsheets these days. This was Barclays getting ready to buy Lehman Brothers. So back in 2007, when all that financial stuff was going on very badly. And what they decided to manage this was that they would put all the contracts that they wanted to buy in a spreadsheet, and then they went ahead and hid the 179 contracts that they didn't want to buy. They went in front of the judge and said, no problem, judge, we've got it all right here in the spreadsheet. But they didn't realize that in between the time of them agreeing on this, a first-year associate had reformatted the Excel spreadsheets in there and unhid all the rows that were previously supposed to be hidden, meaning that Barclays bought everything from Lehman Brothers as opposed to only certain things that they wanted to do. Again, they closed this. They had to go back. Sorry, Your Honor, we know we said it was all there. Believe me, nobody in Barclays Bank does anything sloppy with spreadsheets around this. Another quick story, but UK stopped counting coronavirus cases at one point because one of the health ministries was using the wrong form of Excel spreadsheet document. Not the wrong form of Excel, the wrong form of document. And this one only contained 16,000 cases here, which meant that everybody who came into them, it dropped the cases that were out of it, missing and underreporting by tens of thousands of cases. These things are so crazy, it keeps happening. This is probably one of the more famous ones. I went to visit Mizuho Securities last time I was in Japan, and they still are chagrined about this. It was a loss of face. What they wanted to do was sell one share for 600,000 yen, and the unfortunate individual sold 600,000 shares for 1 yen. It's a lot of yen to the dollar. It resulted in a $350 million mess. More importantly, from a governance perspective, the in-house system did not have limit checking. So if you're not selling penny stocks, you should never have a stock priced as a penny. That's a pretty easy thing to put in place. The Tokyo Stock Exchange didn't also have limit exchange checking. It does now. And finally, it didn't allow for cancellation of orders around all of these things. These are just a couple of examples. You will have your own examples in the organization, and you need to develop stories around them because stories are what sustain data governance. Again, we've covered a bunch of things here. We'll just get to a couple of minutes of takeaways, and we'll be right back at the top of the hour, and look forward to Irene joining us for your questions, as we always do. So the need for data governance is increasing, mainly because the data volume is increasing, but we haven't actually gotten very good at it either. Now, I will say, present company absolutely accept it, but you go 2 steps outside of this piece, or go to a different event, and they'll be looking at you like, what do you mean for data governance, right? So you guys are interested and involved at this point, but you represent about 10% of organizations around the world that are paying attention to these issues. And that means there's a lot of opportunity that you all can take advantage of going forward. This discipline of data governance is relatively new. There is no one best way. The one thing we have discovered is that your organization knows best how to govern its own data. It doesn't mean that you need to be completely guidance-free, and I've already mentioned John Ladley's very fine book on the subject for that, but you're the person that's going to understand how best to implement that within your organization. And it's got to be driven by a data strategy that complements the organizational strategy. If we can't complement and see what's going on from the organization all the way through the data piece in there, it's very unlikely anybody's going to know what's important and what is not from a priority perspective. We've talked about 3 specific strategies. The first one is to keep your data governance practically focused. And when I say practically, I mean 3 items or less. I mean 3 initiatives. I mean make it stuff so that a kindergartner will understand this stuff. And you need to do that because people are only partly paying attention to what's going on in data governance until it comes back and bites them in one form. And somebody blames your data governance program for an IT failure, which may or may not be the case. We've actually been trying to find examples of where we could show governance has delayed IT, and we have not been able to come up with one just yet. Second strategy then is to make sure that data governance and data in general is implemented as a program instead of a project. It's just not, one of the hardest things in the world is to try to convince your organization that they've been doing it wrong, whatever it is that they think they've been doing in here. It's absolutely a major component to make sure that you make sure this goes into that, and gradually add ingredients. And you'll see this as well with the various supports of technology that can come help this. There are lots of good ones, and we've already had a little presentation on one of them that works very, very well in this area as well. But the last thing is to make sure that you learn the value of stories, because stories are how people communicate. And if we don't have those stories to communicate with each other with, very, very difficult to establish anything that is meaningful in the organizations. Remember, as we go back and look over all of the things that we've been looking at here, we're still the ones that are interested and motivated, right? The rest of the folks haven't decided that this is something that they want to spend part of their Tuesday afternoon doing, learning more about data governance. That's actually really good for you all, and you hope it stays that way, because your competitive advantage is going to be very significant compared to theirs. And their perception of data is that it's this little bat sign in between business and IT. And while it's very nice to have data as a perspective between business and IT, data actually is much, much bigger. So as you start to dabble in business, then you will start to see a different set of respect for what's going on. And of course, final message around all this, do not dabble in data. It's impossible to do a good job of dabbling in data, because this is really the way the world is. IT is sort of here and business is there, but data is all around us, washing over us and keeping things moved. I've included a couple of other additional references in here on books on IT. In particular, I would mention Gwen Thomas, who's got a great case for data governance in there if you're having trouble pulling one of those together. Like I said, we've got the special event pricing, and now we get to the part that's a lot more fun. Invite Irene back onto the stage here, and we'll talk about not what's upcoming on these things, but what sort of questions you guys have. There we go, and I'm, 10 seconds off, Shannon? I was pretty close.
You're very close. You're always spot on. Thank you for another great presentation, and thanks, Irene, for your presentation. Just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email for this webinar by end of day Thursday to everybody with links to the slides and recording and anything else requested. So diving in here, how do you calculate the ROI of metadata management?
Mm-hmm. Irene, you want to take that one? I've got a fairly pat answer for that, but maybe you've got something that you guys have looked at.
No, you go ahead, Peter, and then maybe I add to it. Okay.
So one of the things that happens in data is that people think it's difficult to account for. Certainly, it is not accounted for formally on the books, and since metadata is data, this falls into that particular category. The way I like to look at it is to say, and this is following a wonderful book called How to Measure Anything by Douglas Hubbard. I can tell you that as an author of 12 books, I've sold more of Doug Hubbard's books than I have my own, which just says that he's figured out a more fundamental problem to go after. And his insight in that is very much straightforward. If you can observe something, it can be counted. If it can be counted, a cost can be added to it. Even if I only said each penny that we were doing, each query that we were doing here, even though it's done a billion times, only costs the organization a penny. Well, do you think somebody would tell me don't do query optimization because you're only messing with the total cost of a penny? If it does it a billion times, those fractions of pennies add up very, very quickly. So we were able to justify one organization's metadata strategy around a governance activity by just asking the organization, how many IT workers do you have? The answer was in thousands. And what if we could save all of them at least 1 hour per year? That's not a big, big lift. And we were able to show that after the end of the year, most organizations could point to 1 or 2 hours. But we justified the entire project on the basis of a single hour around this. It's not always going to be that easy, but it is oftentimes the case that you can find something that will be helpful to many parts of the organization, because the real challenge around all this is communicating with all the various moving parts, right, Irene?
Yeah, so that's a good answer, Peter. And what I want to add to it is that it will be somewhat different for different organizations, because that part that's important is what is important for a given organization. There could be different business drivers, and therefore there could be focus on different aspects of the ROI. This kind of an idea how much time we could save for each employee is one idea. It's popular in creating business cases. Sometimes it works. Sometimes you could get pushback like, okay, maybe I save everyone 15 minutes a day, but what does it really results in terms of my organization? It doesn't mean that they could have less people, or does it mean that they could use that time more productively if it's just 10 minutes a day split across. So there's various approaches to it. You could also approach it from perspective like, what happens if people can't find the data that they need? What kind of errors or what kind of business goals cannot be realized? So that's another approach. And probably the most important thing that I'm going to say is that whatever your metrics are, start capturing them and start building them into your implementation. So whatever you're implementing, you could then go back and say, you see, this is how I improved those metrics. And this is kind of part of the executive governance that I've talked about that should be integrated into the program.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to point out that we wrote a book on this a couple of years ago called Monetizing Data Management that contains 17 different cases in there about what types of things are actually important and how can they be framed up in terms of the various initiatives that are there. So great question, and yes, it is important because management's going to say, look, why would I authorize additional resources to do something if I don't get a payback from it? Now, once again, many people will say that you can implement data governance for zero cost. I'm going to say that there's probably some disruptions that are going to occur in the organization at the very least. And of course, if you decide that you will need a metadata management solution and all sorts of other things that are part of the process as well, that is also going to become a cost. But that would be something I would add in as seasoning rather than using as a baseline ingredient, if the analogy holds there. Irene, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, totally.
This is starts from. So where have you seen organizations really fall into trouble when they're trying to do an ROI case? You said you'd seen some things that didn't work as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, you have to find out what's important for your business, right? Because it has to resonate with stakeholders, and there are different. From the business perspective, business can be a different point in the life cycle. There could be different competitive forces. There could be different drivers that are important. So it's not that A is a good business case and B is a bad business case. It depends on the organization particular challenges and what's important for the business at this point. Yeah.
And Irene, you said that was the most important thing you were going to say, and I'm just going to agree with you totally. So the most important thing Irene said is the business is what determines what's important from a governance perspective, and that is critical, and that is you all as the subject matter experts with respect to how data governance can help your organization. We babbled a bunch, Shannon, but I think it was a really good start-off question. Thank you.
Indeed, an important question. We get it a lot, so thank you for spending time on it. So what insights, advice can you offer when an IT security is 2 to 4 years ahead of data governance and they have established policies, terms, and definitions, for example, data owners equals leadership? How does data governance approach this mindset?
Mm-hmm. Irene, you want to go first on that one?
Yes, sure. That's a good question, actually. The way I look at it is that maybe you don't have a formal data governance program yet, but your data is being managed today. I mean, I don't care what organization you're in, your organization is somehow managing the data. And it's maybe that those practices are falling short or they could be improved. There are some issues with it, and that's why you want to introduce a formal data governance program to do things better, more comprehensively, to really, close the gaps and meet the full goals, especially as your data grows, etc. So the reason I'm pointing it out is the fact that there is already a group that has some definitions, has some policies in place with respect to security, and of course security has to do with your data and your data access. That's good, and that's to be expected. There is already some data management practices in place, and if they are rich and well-defined, take advantage of them, build on them, incorporate it in your data governance program, and just extend. I think that one of the very first things that you need to do when you start on this journey is find out what is already in place, and where it's succeeding, where it's not succeeding, and how you could add and extend.
Irene's comment about you're already doing this is a very important comment. It's a very good argument back to people when they say, well, we've done just fine. This company's existed for 30 years without data governance. No, it actually hasn't. It's just that, as Irene said politely, it's perhaps not optimal what you're currently doing in those areas. And so it becomes a big challenge all the way around for organizations. So just like we get asked all the time, can you come create a data architecture for me? Well, you know what? You've already got a data architecture. It exists just the same way as your data governance initiatives exist. They may not be formal. They may not be understood. They cannot be helpful if they're not formally documented and understood, but we need to be able to do that. One of the biggest challenges is, in fact, running into an organization where the security people have already gone ahead and done things. Security people are good. We need them to do work. It's absolutely critical, particularly in light of the various breaches that we've had recently. My passport still hasn't shown up on the dark web, which means the Chinese have it. It's just that kind of simple responses that come out of this. But another thing to think about, too, is that while privacy folks and security folks want ownership or responsibility, it can be accomplished through the fiduciary sense. And so even if they've done it, I come back and I say, look, I'm sorry, they've told you wrong. You do not own this data. You have been assigned this data as a fiduciary responsibility, and you need to know what that word means, and you need to know what that means specifically for this organization, for your responsibilities. And the security people will not fight you on that one, but they won't like being corrected. So it's a little bit of a touchy situation. Again, great question, though. Thank you.
All right. So long story here, but a tech manager colleague of mine got our mutual boss to get approval for a data governance lead without formally defining what the role would be. A small company, about 100 employees, do we need a singular person in charge of this, or do you think it would be by committee? And in addition to that, do you still think we need to invest in tools as well? And should we invest the budget that was supposed to go to hiring somebody for this into tools instead?
I don't know enough about the organization. I'm going to guess Irene's going to say the same thing in terms of specific advice. I have seen organizations succeed in both models. It's going to depend a little bit more on what's going on. I will say the one thing that will be necessary in that environment, though, is data leadership. If the data leadership wants to take on the data governance piece and work it from that perspective, there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to have it set so that somebody is, in fact, in charge of the data. And if we don't have that leader that's in charge of the data, it's going to be very difficult for a committee to feel like it's empowered enough or that they know enough. You can imagine the people, I go to work with various organizations on these topics, and I tell them there's no one best way to do this. And they go, what not? You've got 20 years experience. Why isn't there a best way? And the answer is exactly as Irene has said. It depends on what the organizational objectives are. If we don't understand those objectives, the rest of this is probably going to be the right tool for the wrong customer. What do you think, Irene?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think someone needs to be in charge in it as a leader, and because otherwise it's going to be lacking the driver, lacking the purpose, and there could be a committee there's definitely going to be more than one person involved, because even though it's a small organization, there is not going to be one person that knows everything. But there needs to be leadership. As far as for investment in tools, this really depends on how complex your data environment is. And for the relatively simple environment, maybe you could get along with, I'm not going to push tools, maybe you could just get along with spreadsheet or SharePoint or something like that. If you have more complex environment, you could get a tool, including our tool, for relatively little investment. It doesn't mean, though, that you will not need someone driving the program and taking the leadership part, because otherwise then everyone will just focus on their what they see their day job, and this data management responsibilities fall aside, because everyone wants to have the benefit of the effective data governance, but you still need to put in something into it.
And the current practice is what has led us to the current situation. So if you're happy with the current situation, by all means, continue doing exactly what you've been doing. However, if you want to do something different and expect different results, I think there's a famous person that has a statement around there somewhere, you do need to do something different. And that's really one of the first things about this. When we look at working with organizations, the hardest part of this is an organization just getting started. When I'm working with organizations, if an organization is up and running and they've got direction and momentum and things like that, it's a whole lot easier to keep going. But that getting that initial momentum is very, very good, very, very difficult to achieve, particularly in times of stress or confusion. Irene, anything else on that?
No, I agree with everything you said. So
we're just having a good time today, then. Hey, Shana.
I love it.
Let's just have an argument about something.
Yeah, I was going to say, we'll introduce something in there.
Right. No, this is good. This is great. Thank you, guys. As a company right at the beginning of the data governance program and process, when is the right time to introduce a software solution? Is it better to start out the program with a software solution, or better to start with learning, understanding, adapting the data governance process and adding the software later on?
I'll just talk about ordering maybe, and Irene, you could talk about the more specifics there. When people introduce, and I think the most popular scenario that I've seen over the last 3 years has been organizations implementing Salesforce, right? Good software, good stuff, right? And one of the things that I talk about with data governance being about data decisions is that I'll look at a board of directors and say, so you let them implement Salesforce, which is perfectly good software, but then they filled it up with rubbish data. Do you think anybody in your user community is sufficiently versed in data literacy to be able to say, well, I know that Salesforce is good software, but they clearly should have put the data governance in place here before they'd actually gone and loaded this stuff? No, they don't. They say Salesforce sucks, right? And that's all they can understand, is that Salesforce sucks. So be careful that software package doesn't become the initiative around that effort. Irene, over to you.
Yeah, that's definitely an important distinction to keep in mind. What I am going to say that you will need some kind of a tool, and that tool could be a document, or that tool could be a spreadsheet or something. You will need some place to capture your decisions, for example, or you need some place to start outlining your policies, or maybe the kind of roles or the structure of your program. Maybe you need something to start assembling your business glossaries and vocabularies. So you will need to use some kind of tools, maybe very simple, but it will need to happen. I mean, that was one of the reasons why we make our product available in packages, is to provide a relatively low cost for the entry. So just have some place to populate your governance model and capture your decision, or have some place to just do a business glossary at a lower cost that you could get started with and have some kind of a portal where this type of information is available to your stakeholders. You don't need to commit to a big data cataloging solution to get started. And we also make sure that it's all standards-based, standards compliant. So you could then decide to grow it, using our product, or if you decide to use some other product, it's easy to export all the underlying data models and leverage it in a number of ways, or integrate it with something else.
I agree 100%, Irene. We're still hitting perfect on this today. It's a very complex business that you all are watching out for. Even those of you that say, I'm just a one-person shop, it's still a complex business. And so it's very important that you're able to take a step back and say, okay, these things all have a common root problem here that we're trying to address, which is, the aspects of the data and things like that. Absolutely critical to have tools in this. If you try to do it without tools, well, that's what we've been trying for most of the recent history here, and how well has that worked out for us? And I hate to keep saying it, but it is absolutely crazy to try and expect different results by doing exactly the same thing over and over and over again. Really good question. Thank you.
So I have a client in oil and gas wanting to do data security classification. So how would you go about explaining that the security classification requires data governance?
The idea that you can manage and secure data safely without having any form of governance around is ludicrous. And I've got a very dear friend of mine who I've been working with on and off over the years who does exactly that kind of work. And he keeps saying, look, we're both at the same customer, can we do this? But he's reporting up through a risk management profile, and I'm reporting up through an ops profile, or maybe even sometimes an IT profile. These two VPs don't want to talk to each other about sharing results or anything along those lines. And yes, exactly as the questioner asked, it is a silly repetition to go through and do all of that twice when you can do it one time and get a good classification out of it and come away with a reasonable set of savings around all of that. Irene, any thoughts on that? Security is oil and gas.
To me, it sounds almost like a political question.
And yet that is where we started, remember, back at the very beginning. People and process issues are the really data-intensive issues, not the technology issues.
Yeah, and it's maybe what's driving this question is someone kind of trying, various politics in the organization and who is responsible for what and whether they gonna define the security classification as responsibility of group X and data governance responsibility of group Y. But ultimately, that is definitely an important aspect of data governance. Yeah. I
was part of an organization that for 3 years was not allowed to see the finance data that was in SAP because the rest of the organization had criticized the finance data as being perfectly optimized for finance, but not suitable for the rest of the company here. And so finally, the person who was in charge of the finance data just said, I will draw a large iron curtain across my data and nobody can have any finance data. And they literally waited until she retired before they tried to go back after that data again. That's probably not good behavior on the part of most of your organizations. So I wouldn't encourage that.
So back a little bit to the question of ROI. What is the percentage of improvement? What's the benchmark that you can achieve after having data governance in place?
100. Agree, Irene?
Yeah, either that or 42.
42, right, exactly. That's between 100 and 42. It's a hard question. That's what Irene's alluding to here as well. There are good ways of calculating a return on investment for you. Irene and I are not capable of doing it from this perspective unless she's got some abilities that I'm not aware of. But I'm pretty sure she's human like the rest of us. And so, you need more information before you can actually do that. That said, Walmart spends $4 billion a year on IT. Do you think they're paying attention to data governance as a cost-saving measure around how much IT costs they can save? Absolutely they are, and I'd say that without any specific Walmart information.
Irene, anything you want to add to that?
That's perfectly stated.
Love it. All right, you guys. Well, any other questions? I'll give you all a moment to type any last words of inquiry.
So Irene, I had, while she's doing that, I had a debate that I did with a gentleman at one point in time who wanted to fight over whether data was an asset or not. You think we could get into one of those fights sometime?
Yeah, sure. And we could also fight about what is the meaning of an asset. What is an asset in general, right?
That's exactly how it went. That's exactly how it went.
We do have another question, a couple more questions here. Can you please explain a little more on the difference between data strategy and data governance?
Data strategy is oftentimes seen as a very big document, and it's supposed to guide us for the next X number of cycles. I instead like to think of data governance as much closer to what's going to happen in the next battle that we're facing. Because if you don't win the battles, you definitely will not win the war. So I showed this particular slide that talked to the idea that data governance, it needs to be informed by a data strategy, and that data strategy says what should we be focusing on for this next cycle. It may be a cycle of 3 weeks, it may be a cycle of 3 months, it may be a cycle of 3 years, but this next cycle we're going to do X in order to do this. And from that perspective, how well is that doing? And the only reason we're doing anything with data strategy is because we want data to be used to better support the achievement of organizational objectives. So I think that's what the questioner was looking for around that. And the idea is that governance is clearly integral to strategy, and strategy is integral to governance. And the two have to work in an interdependent fashion. Irene, anything to add on that?
Well, you have a perfect slide. So yeah, I mean, data governance is the way to implement your data strategy, and the feedback loop is there as well. So that's.
Irene, I can't resist saying that in the data strategy book that we published, this was the one figure that was published incorrectly. So if you have a copy of the data strategy book, it doesn't look like this. So I'm glad you like it, but we still, unfortunately, didn't have good enough quality control in place to actually solve that. So it's just kind of ironic, but hey, that's the way it goes.
You know, so there's always the typo in the data quality email, right?
You can say that again.
So this last question here, we've got 5 minutes left. What is the most, we could probably have a whole, and we've had full webinars on this topic. What is the most common first step to make in implementing a program?
Do you want to go first on that one, Irene?
A very first step to make, can you repeat that again, Shannon? Very first step to make?
Yeah, what's the most common first step to make to implement a data governance program?
Oh, okay, to implement a data governance program. The most common first step. So I'm gonna, kind of talk about examples and what I've seen people using, and Peter may have, have somewhat of a different example. There's different starting points that you could have, and as I mentioned before, there are some people who would first start on Business Glossary. I've seen that as a common point. I've also seen, and I like this as a starting point, starting with actually inventory of your systems, because it's kind of a higher level catalog than the catalog of your data sources, and that in itself can already drive the value. And at the risk of keeping to repeat myself, is that it's very important in your first step, consider how you could deliver the value quickly. And that may differ from one organization to another, but what would your business stakeholders, what would your business see as a value? Because it's very important to deliver early results and early benefits, so that your program can continues to be supported, and you could then grow that. The wrong thing to do is to start with some complex and comprehensive initiative where you don't see any any tangible results for a long time. So tangible results as early as possible.
I can't improve anything on Irene's answer there. These are things that you could do, but the most important thing is to deliver value, because if you deliver value, people will remember that. And again, if I give you $100 and you give me $105 back at the end of the year, I'm going to remember that and give you another $105 the next year and hope that you can do the same thing again. But I'd sure like to see it proved around all the way. So again, Irene, it's been a real pleasure having you with us today. I hope everybody's gotten something fun out of the event. We will get the slides and all that out to you, and we'll let Shannon close it all up.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you. Oh, go ahead, Irene.
Yeah, just saying thank you, Peter and Shannon. That's been fun.
Enjoyed it.
And thank you both. It's been a great webinar, great discussion. Really have enjoyed the discussion, even though we had no fiery debates. It's been very, very good and has been enjoyed. And thanks to all of our attendees who are so engaged in everything we do. We just always love that, of course. And again, as Peter mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides, the recording, as well as additional information. Thanks to Top Quadrant for sponsoring today and helping make these webinars happen. We really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great day and stay safe out there. Thanks all. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Irene.
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you, Irene.